Hello, and welcome to Classic Movie Recaps. Thank you for watching this video. Today we're recapping the classic sci-fi horror film, Prometheus, directed by Ridley Scott, where archaeologists discover an ancient star map during an expedition, and with the funding of a major corporation, attempt to visit the home planet of humanity's creators. But will these creators be the benevolent beings we expect, or something far more sinister? Sit back, relax, and enjoy. We open up to a scene of an ancient Earth, where a large aircraft is hovering in the skies, while a strange human-like being is standing on top of a waterfall, performing some type of ritual. The being takes off his robe, and picks up a strange circular jar, drinking the contents. As soon as he drinks it, the aircraft leaves the area, and he immediately has a reaction to the substance in the jar. We see the substances breaking down his DNA, and the being immediately begins to break down, falling into the waterfall, and disintegrating into the water. We then see two archaeologists, at an expedition in Scotland. The year is 2089, and the archaeologists, Elizabeth Shaw, and Charlie Holloway, are excavating a cave in Scotland, searching for answers on human origins. After breaking through a passage in the cave, they find cave paintings, which are clearly ancient, and see a figure pointing to a star system. Both of them are in complete awe and disbelief, revealing that this is what they have been searching for, and they believe the location will give them the keys to understanding the origins of humanity, believing it is an invitation of some kind. The year is now 2093, and we see a spacecraft, the Prometheus, floating through space. We then see a strange man, David, walking through the ship, and visiting inhabitants who are in hypersleep. He touches Elizabeth's pod, and he can see Elizabeth's dreams, where Elizabeth is a child, talking to her father about her belief in heaven. David's movements and mannerisms are strange, almost perfect, and he keeps himself busy by staying active, learning ancient languages and watching old films. While performing his duties, the ship slows down, finally reaching its destination, and David finds that the ship's inhabitants are waking up from their hypersleep. He sees Meredith, head of the expedition, doing push-ups. She is the daughter of Peter Wayland, the owner of Wayland Corporation, who funded the ship's construction and the expedition. The ship's crew then attend a briefing on the mission. During the briefing, a hologram of Peter Wayland, who we believe to be deceased, explains the mission's importance, and also advises that David is in fact an android, almost perfect in every way. He then invites Elizabeth and Charlie to share their discoveries. Charlie explains they have found this star map on several different expeditions, from many different ancient cultures, all over the Earth, who all have the same star system depicted on their artwork. He explains that these civilizations were all separated by hundreds of years and completely disconnected, yet showed the people worshipping giant beings, pointing to this star system. Elizabeth then explains that they call these beings the engineers, who created humans. David then takes Elizabeth and Charlie to speak to Meredith. Elizabeth finds a med pod, a piece of machinery able to operate on humans without a surgeon. Meredith then tells them that she doesn't believe in their findings, and if they do find any beings, they are not to make contact, trying to show she's the alpha, and reaffirming that she's in charge. The captain of the ship, Yannick, then starts to bring the ship down to the planet, and Ford, the ship's doctor, advises that the environment is harmful to humans, and they cannot breathe without their suit for more than 2 minutes. While looking down on the planet, however, Charlie sees some strange structures, and the captain lands the ship. The crew then prepares to exit the ship to explore the structure, and Charlie and Elizabeth share a moment, happy they are about to make one of the greatest discoveries in human history. The crew look at the structure with amazement, then proceed to enter. While inside, they use drones to scan the interior, mapping the structure, and Yannick sees there are several tunnels which are not natural. The crew then enter a chamber, and find that something is generating an atmosphere, so they can breathe inside the structure, showing that whoever created it was highly advanced. The crew continues searching, and David discovers some alien writings, and a strange substance on the wall. David appears to be able to decipher the writings, which turn out to be a mechanism of some kind, so he interacts with the writings, and the crew is immediately shown holographic imagery of strange, tall beings running away from something, through the tunnels. The crew decide to chase the holograms, which show one of the beings falling to the ground and dying before a closing door. The crew then investigates the body of the being, who has been decapitated by the door. Charlie asks David if he can read the writings on the door, and one of the scientists gets spooked, deciding to leave the group and return to the ship, taking another scientist with him. The crew then examine the body, while David interacts with the writings, opening the door, and revealing the head of the unknown being. David enters the unlocked chamber, which is filled with mysterious jars, and examines the artwork and murals of the ancient race, remarking that the beings were very human-like. David examines one of the jars, seeing a strange goo-like substance leaking out of the jar. Elizabeth then sees one of the murals changing, and believes the atmosphere in the room has been affected by their presence, ordering Ford to bag the head. Meanwhile on the ship, the crew see a storm brewing, and Yannick orders the crew to return immediately, so the crew begins to leave, but David smuggles one of the strange jars into his bag. The crew jump on their transport vehicles and make it to the ship just in time, but the head falls off the vehicle, and Elizabeth attempts to retrieve it, but is hit by the storm, throwing her meters away from the ship's entrance. Charlie and David then rescue her, using a pulley system to bring her back into the ship. Meanwhile, the two scientists who left the group have become lost in the structure, so Yannick advises them over the radio to remain in the structure until morning, and wait until the storm passes. Back on the ship, the crew examine the head of the being, and Ford discovers that the head is in fact a helmet, so they carefully pry it open, revealing its true appearance. Elizabeth then asks Ford to use electrical impulses to trigger the brain into thinking it's still alive. It opens its eyes and begins to twitch, and the head grows uncontrollably, so they immediately contain it, but unfortunately, it explodes. We then see David, who is using a hyper-sleep helmet to communicate with someone. David has an agenda, which is unknown at this stage. After leaving the room, he is confronted by Meredith, and it is revealed that Peter Wayland is still alive and on board the ship in stasis. David then retrieves the jar he smuggled, examining the strange black substance closely, while Elizabeth examines the DNA of the being, which appears to be a match to human DNA, revealing that the human race is related to the engineers. David continues to examine the contents of the jar, and gives Charlie a drink, which he has secretly spiked with the strange substance. We then see the two scientists, who are exploring the structure, and they are contacted by Yannick, who advises them that they have detected a life form inside the structure, which scares the scientists. Meanwhile, Elizabeth is in her quarters, examining footage of the holographic projections, and theorizes that there may have been an outbreak of some kind. Charlie enters her quarters, and after a brief conversation, tells her she can remove her cross, as they've discovered the creators, but Elizabeth refuses, still believing there is a greater power than the engineers. The two then get intimate and spend the night together. We then see the scientists in the structure, who have entered the chamber with the jars, and are looking at the black substance, which is now leaking out of the jars. They then see something moving through the black goo which has spilt on the ground. The creature appears to be some sort of worm-like reptile. The scientist attempts to be friendly with the creature, but it attacks his hand, crushing his arm. The other scientist cuts the creature to get it off, but it leaks liquid on his helmet, immediately disintegrating the visor. The creature enters the scientist's suit, while the other scientist is being burned by the liquid, falling face first into the black goo. The creature then enters the scientist's mouth as he sits there helpless. Meanwhile on the ship, Charlie is examining himself in the mirror, and sees a parasite inside his eye, spooking him, but doesn't reveal it to anyone. In the morning, the crew then accompanies Yannick to find the missing scientists, who are no longer responding on the radio. David splits off from the group, under the guise of repairing a malfunctioning probe, but comes across another chamber with many jars, which resembles a munitions dump. He continues through the structure, finding a central chamber before we cut back to the crew. The crew is exploring the main room they were in previously, and Charlie stumbles, revealing to Elizabeth that he is sick. While Elizabeth is tending to Charlie, the crew find the dead scientists, and Elizabeth advises the crew that they need to leave immediately for Charlie's safety. The crew are then startled when the worm-like creature jumps out of the dead scientist's body and escapes into the goo. The crew leave the structure, and Elizabeth radios the Prometheus, advising that Charlie is sick, while Charlie's condition deteriorates. Meanwhile David, who is still exploring the main chamber, interacts with some mysterious buttons, which turns a large throne towards him. David then sits in the throne, and a hologram activates, showing engineers entering the chamber. David examines one of the holograms, which sits in the throne, and uses an instrument to activate a machine. A hologram of the universe then appears in the center of the chamber, and David is amazed as he examines the universe, enjoying the wonders around him, before the hologram abruptly ends. He then approaches a strange pod-like machine, and finds that it contains an engineer, who is still alive in hypersleep. We then cut to the crew, who are in the transport vehicle, and Charlie's condition worsens, but Meredith refuses to open the doors of the ship. Yannick then orders his crew to open the airlock, and they oblige, but Meredith, not wanting to jeopardize the safety of the ship, stands at the entrance with a flamethrower, prepared to burn Charlie if they try to enter. Yannick argues with Meredith, while Charlie suffers on the ground, and the crew attempt to persuade Meredith to help him, but she refuses. Charlie then tells Elizabeth he loves her, knowing what must be done, and approaches Meredith, to end his life and save the crew. Meredith then burns Charlie while Elizabeth cries in anguish. Later that day, Elizabeth wakes up in the medical bay, and David offers his condolences. Elizabeth advises that they have all been exposed to a contagion, and they need to run blood tests on everybody. David then reveals to Elizabeth that she is 3 months pregnant, which she doesn't believe, as she was only intimate with Charlie on the previous day. David explains that the fetus is not human, and Elizabeth begs David to remove the creature from her, but David refuses, and sedates her so she cannot fight back. David then reveals his evil side, teasing her about her father, who died from a disease on an expedition, and pointing out the irony of her situation. Ford then attempts to move Elizabeth to a hypersleep chamber, but Elizabeth pretends to be asleep, and attacks the scientists, escaping the containment room. Elizabeth then runs to the med pod she saw in Meredith's room, and uses the machine to remove the creature from her body, which turns out to be a violent squid-like animal. Elizabeth then exits the med pod, and attempts to decontaminate the pod, trapping the creature inside. Meanwhile, Yannick reports to the crew that they are detecting one of the missing scientists outside the ship's door. One of the crew opens the ship, and sees the burned scientist, who has transformed into a zombie-like creature with superhuman strength. The creature attacks the crew inside the airlock, killing some of them, while Yannick grabs some crew members to head down and fight. We then see Elizabeth, who is walking through the ship, attempting to escape, but is having difficulty due to her medical procedure. Down in the airlock, however, the battle continues, and the creature seems to be impervious to the crew's guns, killing several crewmates. One of the crew members enters a vehicle, and runs over the creature, just as Yannick enters the airlock, using his flamethrower while one of the crew shoots it, finally ending its life. We then see Elizabeth, who enters a room, seeing David and several medical staff tending to Peter Whalen. Peter reveals that he only has a few days of life left, and wants to meet an engineer before he dies. Elizabeth says they're all dead, but David reveals one is still alive, and they are going to meet him. Peter explains that he will ask the engineer for eternal life, but Elizabeth tells Peter that the engineers are dangerous, and they must leave immediately. Peter refuses, however, telling her they are so close to answering life's most meaningful questions. Elizabeth is getting ready to meet the engineer when Yannick enters the room, telling her that this place is dangerous, and this isn't a home planet, it's a military installation, used to create weapons of mass destruction, which is what the black goo is. He tries to convince Elizabeth to persuade the others to leave, but Elizabeth wants to hear what the engineer has to say. Yannick says he does not care, and he can't let the black goo get back to Earth. We then see the crew rigging up an exoskeleton to Peter, when Meredith enters, telling him that he will die if he leaves the ship. Meredith hates her father because he refuses to die, and she is worried that she will not become the head of Whalen Corporation. David then enters the transport vehicle, and teases Elizabeth again, revealing his evil nature, when Peter enters the vehicle, and they drive to the structure to speak to the engineer. The team then make their way through the structure and pass through the munitions room, which David describes as a cargo bay. Elizabeth is shocked, and shows Yannick what she sees by transmission. Yannick then orders the crew to bring up the mapping of the structure they collected from the probes, and upon closer examination, discovers that a functional alien ship is inside. Meanwhile, inside the structure, David shows the crew the main room, remarking that the engineers were a superior species, revealing their hypersleep chambers. David then activates the machine, and explains that the engineers were attempting to leave to Earth before they died. Elizabeth asks why, and David tells Elizabeth they wanted to exterminate humanity. David then shows Peter the sleeping engineer and advises that he believes he can speak to the creature. David then activates the hyper-sleep chamber, while the crew look on in fear. The engineer awakens, taking a second to gather his strength, before standing up, towering over the crew. He climbs off the pod, but stumbles down, trying to recuperate. At this moment, Peter asks David to translate for him, and tells the engineer that they have visited him, just as he asked. Elizabeth then interrupts, asking him about the black goo, and why they wanted to exterminate humans, but Peter orders his guard to silence her. Peter then tells David to explain to the engineer why they came, and the engineer examines David, knowing that he is an android. The engineer then lifts David off the ground, and rips off his head, using it to strike Peter. The engineer attacks the rest of the crew, and sees Elizabeth running away, who he ignores. Meanwhile on the ship, Meredith sees Peter dying on the ground, and orders the ship to prepare for takeoff. Back in the structure, the engineer prepares the alien ship, while David, still functional, looks on. The engineer then climbs into the cockpit, and starts the ship's engine, which sends a cloud of dust through the structure, throwing Elizabeth off her feet. Elizabeth finally exits the structure, and runs for the Prometheus, but the ground shakes and opens up, as the alien ship prepares to leave. Elizabeth jumps over a gap, and barely makes it, when she is contacted by Yannick over the radio. Elizabeth explains that the engineer is preparing to leave in his ship, and must be stopped. Meredith, however, refuses to stop it, telling Elizabeth that they are leaving. Elizabeth then tells them that the engineer is planning to leave for Earth, to exterminate the human species. Yannick tells Elizabeth that the Prometheus is not a warship, which she knows, but begs Yannick to believe her, and do something to stop it. Meredith tells the captain to leave immediately, which Yannick refuses, telling Meredith to get to an escape pod, which will give her 2 years of life, or she can stay on the Prometheus and die. Yannick then tells his crewmates to join Meredith on the escape pods, but they refuse, agreeing to die alongside him, and bring down the engineer's ship to save humanity. Meredith runs for the escape pod and grabs a suit, preparing to leave in the pod, while the Prometheus prepares to take off. Yannick then gives the order to bring the Prometheus as close to the engineer's ship as possible, while the escape pod ejects. Elizabeth looks on, as the Prometheus takes off, and the escape pod crashes nearby. Yannick then gives a battle cry as the Prometheus speeds towards the engineer's ship, crashing into it in a spectacular fashion, and causing a massive explosion. Meredith and Elizabeth watch the skies, as the alien ship falls to the surface, crashing into the ground. The ship then starts to roll over, and both Elizabeth and Meredith run away to avoid being crushed, while debris falls from the air around them. Elizabeth trips over, falling on the ground, but manages to roll out of the ship's path, while Meredith fails to escape, falling over before being crushed by the ship. The ship then appears to be standing steady for a moment, and Elizabeth gets a moment to breathe, but it begins to fall to the ground. Elizabeth looks like she will be crushed by the immense craft, backing herself into some rocks and accepting her fate, but it narrowly misses Elizabeth as it hits the ground, stopped by the small rock formation. Elizabeth is thankful to be alive, but receives an automated message from her suit, that she has only 2 minutes of oxygen remaining. She crawls out of the rubble, and makes her way to a detached life support pod, which Yannick released from the Prometheus before the crash. Elizabeth makes it to the pod with seconds to spare, and seals the airlock, saving her life. She immediately begins to gather supplies, but is startled by a roar from somewhere in the pod. She then grabs an axe, and begins to investigate the pod for the source of the sound. As Elizabeth moves slowly through the pod, she approaches a door, and cautiously looks through the pod's small window, but is startled when a huge tentacle slams the door. This is the squid-like animal Elizabeth removed from her body earlier. As Elizabeth backs away from the door, she is contacted by David, who tells her that the engineer is coming for her, and within moments, the engineer is seen prying the doors of the pod open with sheer strength. The engineer then charges Elizabeth, but Elizabeth opens the pod door, releasing the squid-like creature, which immediately attacks the engineer, forcing the engineer to release Elizabeth. Elizabeth then gets to her feet and attempts to escape the pod, while the engineer continues battling the creature. The engineer is being overpowered by the creature, and uses all of his strength to stay alive, while Elizabeth escapes the pod. Unfortunately for the engineer, he is defeated by the creature, which opens its mouth, and sends a tentacle down his throat, beginning to consume the engineer as he falls to the ground, defeated by his own weapon. Elizabeth is then sobbing hopelessly on the ground, when she is contacted once more by David through her suit. David reveals he needs Elizabeth's help, however, considering what he did to her, she refuses. David then tells her that there are other engineer ships, and he can operate them with her help, to get them off the planet. Elizabeth agrees to help, and enters the alien ship to retrieve David. David tells her that a ship could get them back to Earth, but Elizabeth wants to find the engineers' planet, and understand why they wanted to destroy humanity. Elizabeth then takes David, zipping him up in a bag where he belongs, and drives a transport vehicle back to the structure. We then see an engineer craft, leaving the atmosphere of the planet in a beam of light, as David and Elizabeth continue their journey. Meanwhile, back on the planet, the body of the engineer is shaking and twitching on the floor, when a new breed of creature emerges from his body, giving birth to the alien, made famous in the Alien franchise. The film Prometheus experienced a mostly positive reception upon release, and was praised for its haunting visuals, stunning effects and compelling performances, particularly by Michael Fassbender's performance as the android David, receiving almost universal acclaim. The movie is now considered a classic by fans of the Alien franchise. Thank you for watching this video. If you've enjoyed, please like, comment, and subscribe. Have a fantastic day.